Going to prison is not fun in any country of the world. After all, it is meant to be a punishment, the fear of which keeps our society together. Prison is a depressing place in which you'll meet a lot of dangerous characters. However, prison in Russia might be actually even worse. If you want to survive Russian jail, you have to live by a very strict code of conduct. And even though such a code exists in prisons all over the world, the rules of the Russian prison are on another level. Russia and other countries of the ex-Soviet Union have a very strange and deep prison lore, which is rooted in the massive repressions during the times of Stalin, where millions of people ended up in the gulags. In every post-Soviet state, the prisoners in the criminal society basically have their own country within a country, with their own rules, traditions, and even their own language. On Russian YouTube, for example, videos about prison rules, how to act the right way in prison, which words to use and not to use in jail, and so on, get millions of views. Russians, and especially Russian men, pretty much have to know about these things for two reasons. The first one is because every Russian man at one point in his life does realize that it's very easy for him to end up in prison in this country. We even have a saying in Russian, "От тюрьмы и сумы не зарекайся." In Russia, many people know deep down that there's truly no rule of law and anything can happen to you at any moment, so you have to be prepared just in case. And the second reason is that these prison rules are actually even relevant on the outside, because a lot of people who are either ex-convicts or just like gopniks and wannabe gangsters actually live by these prison rules in regular day-to-day life. So in Russia, if you do get pressed by gopniks in a dark alleyway somewhere, they will ask you which prison caste you belong to, and also they will get extremely hostile if you accidentally use any words that are considered as unacceptable according to the prison code. And if you don't know these rules in prison, it's very easy to accidentally break them, and as a result to either become an untouchable or pay the ultimate price with your life. So hey there people, it is your boy Roman, your favorite neighborhood Russian, and in today's video, we'll be talking about some of the insane prison rules of Russia in the post-Soviet world, all the reasons why you should not end up in Russian prison, and also why this prison culture is still so prevalent in modern Russia. Now it's believed that the modern prison rules of Russia actually held back all the way to the times of the Russian Empire, originally forming in prison labor camps. The Russian Tsar would send thousands of prisoners on a so-called katorga to work in remote areas of the country where convicts would be either mining resources or building infrastructure. Joseph Stalin himself was in one of these camps, for example, and later he continued the great tradition as the leader of the Soviet Union. Several million people went through the Soviet labor camps, also known as gulags, before, during, and after World War II. These prisoners often worked in inhumane conditions, being sent to distant regions of the Far East and Siberia, where hundreds of thousands would die because of hunger and frost. Many of the prisoners were the so-called enemies of the new Soviet state. People with anti-communist views, White Army soldiers who fought against the Soviets in a civil war, or simply just regular people who have been wrongfully convicted of something that the NKVD completely made up, which happened all the time. This led to a situation where most people behind bars became actively anti-governments and anti-Soviet. And after the end of World War II in the 1950s, many Soviet soldiers that bravely fought for the country but ended up being taken as prisoners of war by the Nazis also ended up being sent to the gulags by the Soviet government that considered these soldiers to be treasonous. With the overall lawlessness of the country, due to the harsh weather conditions and due to the fact that many people in Soviet prisons felt like they did not deserve their punishment and like they were framed, the prison rules in Russia and other post-Soviet countries mainly formed around the idea of disobeying the people in power and the government in all of its forms, as well as refusing to respect the law and the police. This refusal of collaborating with the government as a rule actually caused a massive prison war in the 1940s and 50s in the Soviet Union, when during World War II many prisoners agreed to join the Red Army for a pardon, but then once again ended up in prison after the end of the war. According to the inmates who refused to join the army and stayed in the Gulag, these other prisoners that just came back from war were seen as traitors who betrayed the criminal rules and the thieves' codes. All of this led to what was known as the Bitch Wars, or the Suka Wars. Yes, that is the actual name because they call the people that collaborate with the government sukas in Russian prison. This confrontation actually went on for decades, and a lot of gulags actually had separate sections for the thieves and also the so-called bitches that collaborated with the governments. But after some time and some effort from Soviet officials, the tensions actually came down. Both groups kind of disappeared into each other, and the Russian military actually became a lot like the Russian prison in many ways. So a lot of the traditions of the modern Russian prison actually come from those Soviet Gulag days, although many of them have changed with time. For example, the infamous Soviet prison tattoo culture, where every inmate would get symbolic tattoos that would showcase the prisoner's status in the caste system. They could have references to the committed crimes or the sentence, portray the convict's personal life, the prison where one did their time, and so on. In the Soviet Union, having tattoos was actually mainly associated with the criminal subculture, and it kinda made you an outcast in society. And even in post-Soviet Russia, at one point it was actually not recommended to have tattoos if you're going to prison, because the people on the inside might ask you to explain your tattoos. And they could even put you in the untouchable caste if you have any tattoos on you that have a symbolic meaning in prison and you cannot really justify having them. This is a tradition that has kinda softened these days. While the criminal tattoo tradition still exists, tattoos outside of prison have become very common. And as far as I've heard, these days in Russian prison, nobody really cares if you have any tattoos. But that does not mean that it's totally impossible that somebody might actually ask you questions and care. Another important thing is also the Russian prison language. The criminal underworld in post-Soviet countries has its own distinct vocabulary and jargon. These prison rules of speaking are known in Russian as понятия, which literally means concepts or understandings. If you're in prison, you have to live according to the понятия, which means using special words and carrying yourself a certain way. Pretty much any word in Russian has a prison version. For example, instead of saying милиционер, which was the word for a Soviet cop, the prisoners call them мусор, which quite literally means trash. And the police are still commonly called that to this day in Russia. Or for example, the prison itself is called zona, which means the zone. A prison caste is called масть, which literally translates to suit, like in a playing card game. And the list goes on and on and on. Also, completely normal and reasonable Russian words become offensive in a prison context. The Russian word for to ask, спросить, for example, is extremely offensive to use. If in regular life in Russia you can come up to a person in the street and say «Можно у вас спросить?» so can I ask you? In prison that can actually be deadly because the Russian word for to ask, спросить, comes from the same root as the Russian word for demand, спрос. So in prison saying I want to ask you actually has the meaning of I'm demanding something from you, which is almost like considered a question of whether I can rob you or not, and you can basically get killed for it. Another example is the Russian word спасибо, which quite literally means thanks. It is also considered not nice to use and to be a sign of forced gratitude, so instead you should say I am grateful, благодарю, or от души, which means like I'm grateful from my soul to you. So yeah, having a conversation in Russian and in prison Russian is completely different. And speaking to anybody in a Russian prison is basically like walking on a minefield. And because prison culture is so relevant even outside of prison in Russia, many of these rules and words actually start existing in the day-to-day life of regular people. And they simply become part of the proper Russian language. Another classic topic are also Russian prison games and riddles. Yes, riddles. Imagine this, you've just been convicted, you walk inside the prison cell, the door shuts behind you, and now you have to complete a Russian prison riddle that will immediately determine your fate for the next 10 years behind bars. A classic example of this is when a newcomer enters a cell and one of the inmates throws a towel at the feet of the person that just entered. It's a sort of a classic prison test to show whether the person that's entering knows the prison rules and law. If you know the rules, you're supposed to wipe your shoes on the towel, step over it, and come in and ask who runs the cell. But if the person who comes in does not know the rules, he will usually probably reach down and try to pick up the towel, which is considered as inappropriate behavior according to the prison rules, because apparently anything that is dropped on the ground becomes contaminated or something. And if you pick up the towel, it shows to the rest that you don't know anything about prison rules and you will probably be excluded from the criminal world, basically. There's even been stories when the people who would pick up the towel would immediately get considered as untouchables, which is a really bad thing to be in Russian prison. Or for example, I've heard stories about how a person would come into the cell and immediately start shaking hands with everybody inside, and they would accidentally first shake the hand of a so-called untouchable without knowing it, which immediately renders them untouchable for the rest of their prison sentence. Apparently situations like these are not very common these days, but they're still possible. So like I already said, being in a lower caste in a Russian prison is pretty bad. But how really bad is it? Well, Russian prisons actually have a very strict hierarchy and a very expansive caste system, the strictness of which can actually vary based on the type of prison that you're spending your time in. The rules of the prison are enforced by prison gangs, which actually can take control over one or even several prisons. At the head of a prison gang is a sort of a crowned criminal leader known as a thief-in-law or вор в законе. A thief-in-law is usually a very high-ranking career criminal who pretty much lives in prison, whose job it is to rule over a particular prison, make sure that the law of the thieves is respected, and also also to sort out any potential conflicts or disputes that happen between the inmates. This criminal also manages the gang's finances. To avoid trouble, every single prisoner has to donate either money, food, or some kind of valuables to the so-called общак, which is basically kind of like a collective fund of the prisoners inside the prison. And the thief-in-law also controls that. These wor в законе enjoy a special status and special privileges in the criminal world, kind of like a made man in the Italian mafia. Thieves-in-law actually persecuted pretty heavily by a lot of the post-Soviet countries, and they actually are even completely banned in the country of Georgia, which is a place where a lot of thieves-in-law came from in the Soviet Union. When it comes to prison castes, there are 4 main ones that are usually outlined. The highest ranking caste is the so-called blatные, which I guess the closest translation would be like players or something. I don't know guys, it's impossible to translate a lot of this stuff. These are the criminals who have authority and respect in prison and who enjoy better privileges than the rest. To become part of this caste, you basically have to be a career criminal who spends most of his time on the inside. It's also often a requirement that you've never served in the army or worked any service job. These high-ranking prisoners control the flow of cash and goods inside the prison from the outside, and they can also sort out conflicts between inmates. Never claim yourself to be part of this caste though if you're not, because if you get caught lying, which you will, you can pretty much get killed for claiming something that you're not. The second ranking caste in the Russian prison system are the so-called muzhiki, which simply translates to men or dudes. Most inmates in Russian prisons actually fall under this category. These are not career criminals or people who are part of the criminal underworld. Pretty much anyone who has committed a crime for the first time and who is in prison for the first time ever will be considered a part of this caste. This is pretty much the most normal caste to be in Russian prison. You still have to live under the criminal code, but as long as you respect it and as long as you have no issues with the higher up criminals, you'll be probably left alone. You still have to donate to the criminal fund, but you don't really get to decide where the money goes. That is for the higher caste to decide. The next caste that is one step below are the prisoners that collaborate with the prison administration or the police, known as Reds, Krasные, or bitches, suki. Now I've already described how this caste was hated historically and how that all comes from the Soviet times. These days though, the status of these Reds can actually be very different. Well, according to the OG Soviet prison rules, any person who pretty much has any contact with the government or the police pretty much deserves to be unalived. In modern Russian prison, coming into contact with the administration is actually not always considered unacceptable. For example, a prisoner working for the administration as a librarian would not be really considered a snitch if he hasn't done anything that breaks the criminal code. Russia even has so-called red prisons, where the police sort of doesn't let the prison culture exist, and there the people who work with the police are actually in even better positions than the rest. So it really depends on a case-by-case basis, but in general, it is better to not be affiliated with the government or the police. And last but not least, we have the absolute bottom of the hierarchy of the Russian prison, the most infamous Russian prison caste. This is the caste of the so-called опущенный, which quite literally means somebody who's been brought down or put down, also known as петухи, which literally means roosters. I refer to these people in this video as untouchables because that's pretty much what they are. These people have it the roughest in Russian prison. The rules of what makes one become part of this caste are actually both hilarious and sad. First of all, you can obviously imagine that Russian prison is probably a very homophobic place, kinda like every prison in the world. So any openly gay person in Russian jail automatically becomes part of the untouchable caste and pretty much loses all of their rights. The rooster in a Russian prison can be pretty much used by any of the other inmates without being able to do anything about it. What's quite interesting though and quite funny is that this law only works if you're a bottom, not a top. So if you're a man who gives it to other men and does not take it, right, then you're actually not considered untouchable by the Russian prison rules. Yes guys, that is correct, and what's even more ridiculous is that according to the Russian prison rules, having fully heterosexual intercourse with a female as a man, right, in the wrong way can also make you end up being considered as part of the untouchable caste. For example, you are not supposed to give oral to a woman as a man. And if you have ever done it, you are not supposed to talk about it or to mention it to anybody in prison. If you do, you'll be immediately brought down to the lowest level of the hierarchy and your life is pretty much over. So yes guys, according to the Russian prison rules and hardcore Russian prisoners, eating is gay, while quite literally bonking another man in prison is considered not gay. Absolutely incredible logic, but yes, that's just how mafia works. Another way to end up in the slowest caste of the Russian prison is to commit a massive unjustified act of disrespect towards the criminal code or another inmate. Yes, you are allowed to kill people and do heinous things according to the prison codes, but only if you do it justifiably and if you receive the go-to, essentially. Russian prison culture is overall supposed to be about respecting others, which is quite funny considering that a lot of the time, some people get treated like absolute trash for doing basically nothing. However, the respect has to be there. And if you disrespect the rules, protest against the higher-ups in the criminal world, insult them and so on, you will be pretty much becoming a rent boy in prison. A person that becomes part of this rooster caste literally cannot be touched by anybody from a different caste. And even sitting at the same table as an untouchable, or like accidentally grabbing their fork or their plate or something and touching their things, can immediately make you part of the untouchables as well. And also, much like it is in prison in the United States, for example, people convicted of sexual crimes, especially those involving minors, are also made untouchable in the Russian prison and have a very horrifying existence. In a way, this prison hierarchy and the way the castes work actually influenced the Soviet and then the Russian military as well. A common thing in the Soviet army was the so-called dedovshchina, which was an informal but systematic abuse of young conscripts in the army. Every new soldier that was drafted would get constantly beaten and bullied by older soldiers who were conscripted earlier, which are called ded or grandfather. And then the younger conscripts would continue the cycle of abuse when they themselves become older soldiers and start bullying newcomers. Basically, it's the same exact story about people being trapped in a bad situation who are basically just abusing their power against the weak out of boredom. Such is the banality of evil. So yes, being in Russian prison as a normal person is pretty much all about trying your hardest to not become part of the lowest caste. And for other inmates, it might as well be about just trying to humiliate the lower caste as much as possible out of boredom. The untouchables have a ton of variations of embarrassing things that they're supposed to do. To give you one example, Russian prisons, and in particular juvenile prisons, have a special type of an untouchable prisoner known as the gas huffer or gazanyu, whose job it is to Yes, I think you've already probably guessed it. It's huffing farts of other prisoners. Farting is actually another thing that is kind of forbidden in Russian prison. If you're in a cell with other people and you want to fart, you have to go to the toilet and do it there. If you do it simply while being next to somebody, or God forbid when somebody else is eating, it is a massive violation of the code that may get you in a lot of trouble. Gas huffer exists for this particular reason. Apparently, a more higher up respected criminal can say that he wants to fart. The gas huffer is basically supposed to come up to the criminal and quite literally inhale his fart inside his lungs. After which he is supposed to run to the window and then inhale the fart outside into the window. In turn, this actually captures the farts and makes it so that the person who farted hasn't actually broken the criminal code because he got this humiliated person to huff his gas and save it. I know, guys, this sounds ridiculous, but trust me, I am not making any of this up. This is just the insanity of Russian prison. So all in all, I think it makes a lot of sense why videos on Russian YouTube in which people talk about how to act properly in prison and how to not become part of the roosters are getting millions of views. It is way too easy to become a criminal and to end up in prison in this country, and then who knows? You might end up accidentally breaking some prison rules that you did not know about and turn into a gas huffer as a result. Nobody wants that kind of fate, so every single Russian man, even if he has zero intention of breaking the law, still kinda has to know these rules. And overall, growing up and living in Russia, it is actually impossible not to learn this stuff, even if you try really hard to ignore it and avoid it. It feels like this prison culture and these prison rules are kind of everywhere, especially like in a city where I grew up, Chelyabinsk, which is an industrial provincial city of Russia. We have a lot of really hardcore gopnik dudes out there, right? And pretty much every single time I've been involved in a fight, or I witnessed like a fight in the street or something, or any conflict or arguments, it is always 100% a given that somebody will invoke the понятия, or the prison rules. If you're in a fight with somebody, if some gopnik dude is trying to, start crap with you, it is almost 99% guaranteed that he will ask you what your caste is in the prison hierarchy. And even when I was in school, there were kids in my school who wanted to live this lifestyle of the Russian gangsters and wanted to live by the prison rules outside of prison. And I think it makes total sense why this prison culture is so widespread in Russia today. First of all, simply an insane amount of people went through the Stalin repressions and the gulags, so all of these prison rules left an immense impact on language and culture. There was even a saying in the Soviet Union, "Полстраны сидит, полстраны охраняет." And later after the fall of the Soviet Union, we had the period of the wild 90s in Russia, which was a time of straight up anarchy and a lot of organized crime. And this period has massively reignited the relevance of the criminal language, the criminal rules and so on in people's lives. The regular people basically had to learn these rules to survive. And given the fact that in modern Russia under Vladimir Putin we now have a new wave of censorship and repressions, a lot of people are once again began feeling pretty negatively about the government, the police, and the Russian law in general. And all of this also breeds people that can potentially be interested in this kind of gang culture. Even though the values of a lot of young Russians these days do not really line up with the strict criminal codes, they can still adopt the exact same negative attitudes towards the state, the law enforcement, and so on as the prisoners have. And the Russian government of Vladimir Putin is actually trying to combat these kind of moods in society. For example, in 2020, Russia officially considered the so-called AUE movement to be an extremist and banned organization. AUE is essentially not really a movement, but more of a decentralized youth subculture that was popular in some parts of Russia. And the whole idea of the subculture was basically that the members would live under the prison rules and the prison code of conduct in day-to-day life. All of that now is officially banned. And Russia actually now considers criminal tattoos, criminal symbols, criminal slogans, and so on to be extremist material that you cannot spread. And if you spread any of this, you will go to prison. So long story short, it's another way of Russia cracking down on, ideologies and movements that it considers to be threatening to the public order. However, this ban obviously did not end and will not end the prison culture in Russia. It will still continue to exist both on the outside and the inside in one form or the other. So yes, long story short, the moral of the story is, do not end up in Russian prison. Once again, I do understand that prison is obviously not meant to be a fun place anywhere in the world. I mean, maybe unless you're like in Norway or something, where you get like a PS5 and a nice apartment or something, but prison is prison, right? It is a punishment and it's a place where a lot of crazy stuff can happen. But once again, the rules in Russia might just be on another level. And while a lot of the insanity of Russian prison is obviously there because of the Russian governments, because of the way the system is set up, the whole institution of courts and police in Russia is messed up. The police can torture people to get them to confess anything. Courts in Russia have like a 99.8% conviction rate, meaning that, if there's a case against you, you will be essentially considered guilty 99.8% of the time. And the conditions in Russian prisons can get disgusting. And we've all seen, for example, what happened to Alexei Navalny, the Putin critic who died in jail, who was basically being tortured by the governments in there. Yes, a lot of the hardships of the Russian prison are there because of the Russian governments. And that's pretty much a whole separate topic, but a lot of the real insanity of Russian prison actually comes from the relationships between the inmates, and all the possible drama and the humiliation that the prison code of conduct can bring. So once again, guys, just the moral of this story is very simple. Try not to end up in Russian prison. It is not fun, and you will not survive. Anyways, people, I guess that's gonna be pretty much it for today's video, though. If you guys did enjoy it, then please make sure to slap that like button on it. Let me know if you enjoyed this deep dive into the Russian prison lore. If you guys support what I do in this channel, you can either go down to the link down in the description, become a YouTube channel member, or buy me a coffee. It helps me out quite a lot. And yeah, people, thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.